The Pharaoh, God on earth, son of the sun, ruler of the Nile. A man whose business card, if they'd had those, would have needed 3 pages and a gold trim. His official image was perfection itself, divine, untouchable, radiant, chosen by the gods to guide humanity. A walking miracle in a linen kilt, at least that's what the temple walls said. The reality? Well, let's just say being Pharaoh wasn't all golden thrones and worshipful peasants. Yes, he was powerful, yes, he was rich, and yes, he could have people build him pyramids big enough to confuse modern tourists, but he was also just a guy living in the desert, sweating through itchy robes, chewing on sandy bread, and getting woken up by flies. So what did a typical morning look like for the most powerful man in Egypt? Spoiler, it's a lot less glamorous divine sunrise and a lot more man stuck in a sauna with questionable breakfast choices. Let's start with the wake-up call. No alarm clocks, no snooze buttons, no soft harp music. Just buzzing, constant buzzing, flies, mosquitoes, whatever else decided the royal bedchamber was a fun place to hang out. Forget your iPhone alarm. The Pharaoh's morning started with bzzz directly in the ear. You'd think being a god king might come with divine pest control. Nope. In Egypt, even Ra himself couldn't keep out the flies. And about that royal bedchamber, it looked impressive. Carved cedar wood, gold leaf decorations, fancy linens. Caird screamed luxury. But here's the secret. Comfort-wise, it wasn't much better than what the average farmer had. His mattress? Woven reeds stuffed with hay. Great for showing off, terrible for your back. No springs, no memory foam, just a glorified mat with some gold paint slapped on the edges. The kind of thing that would make even a monk complain. Temperature control? Forget it. Nights could be chilly, mornings hot, and palaces weren't exactly insulated. By the time the Pharaoh rolled out of bed, he was either shivering or sweating like a marathon runner at mile 20. No matter how divine your bloodline, desert weather did not discriminate. Now, once His Majesty finally groaned his way out of bed, it was time to freshen up. Of course, the Pharaoh didn't brush his own teeth or wash his own face. That would have been far too mortal. Instead, a small army of servants rushed in to handle the basics. His version of a morning routine looked more like the backstage of a fashion show. Let's talk teeth. Ancient Egyptians were surprisingly into dental care, at least in theory. They used tooth powders made of ground pumice, eggshells, and natron. Sounds fancy until you realize that's basically gravel, chalk, and baking soda. Imagine chewing sand and calling it minty fresh. It might have scraped off some plaque, but it also scraped off, well, your actual teeth, which explains why so many royal mummies were found with worn-down chompers. The Pharaoh smiled like a god in statues, but in reality his mouth was probably a dental horror show. After the tooth torture came the oils. Perfumed oils, thick creams, sticky ointments. Servants slathered him head to toe like he was about to enter an ancient bodybuilding competition. Why? Because in a desert without showers, you didn't fight sweat, you drowned it in perfume. Smelling divine was a political necessity. You couldn't exactly walk into the temple reeking like a camel stable. So gallons of incense and perfume filled the room, trying desperately to mask the truth. Hundreds of servants, stale air, and a palace that smelled like onions and feet. Of course, this process wasn't exactly comfortable. Being rubbed with oils every single morning meant you were perpetually sticky. Imagine leaving your house every day, already feeling like you fell into a jar of honey. Combine that with the Egyptian heat and congratulations. You've invented human flypaper. Once the Pharaoh was shiny enough to reflect the morning sun, it was time to get dressed. Forget sweatpants and a t-shirt. The uniform of divinity was linen. White linen robes, light and elegant, at least in theory. In practice, ancient linen was rough, stiff, and itchy. More cheap bedsheet than luxury fabric. Add in layers of golden jewelry, collars, rings, armlets, and suddenly you're sweating in what amounts to a wearable oven. And then there were the crowns. You've seen the pictures, massive, elaborate headpieces that look like they weigh more than a toddler. Were they majestic? Absolutely. Comfortable? Not even close. The Pharaoh probably wore lighter headdresses on regular mornings, because no one wants to start their day with a neck cramp. Still, even a casual royal outfit was more about looking divine than feeling comfortable. Now that the pharaoh was perfumed, polished, and draped in bling, it was time for the most important part of the morning: breakfast. And here's where things get really tragic, because despite the gold, the power, the army of servants, the pharaoh's breakfast was, well, underwhelming. Bread, beer, onions, maybe some figs if it was a good day. That was the royal spread. Forget bacon and eggs. Forget avocado toast. Forget coffee. The pharaoh's morning fuel was the same stuff farmers ate, just served on fancier plates. And let's talk about that bread. Ancient Egyptian bread was legendary, not for its flavor, but for its texture. Grinding grain on stone meant little flecks of sand got into the flour, so every bite was basically edible sandpaper. The pharaoh might have had gold on his table, but he also had sand in his sandwich. Dental wear in ancient mummies is so bad that you can practically see the bread fights they lost. Imagine being ruler of the known world, and the true enemy is breakfast. Beer was another staple, not the crisp, refreshing kind. Ancient Egyptian beer was thick, sour, and lumpy, more like a bready porridge than a cold lager. And yes, they drank it for breakfast. Why? Because Nile water was less refreshing beverage and more parasitic gamble. So beer was safer. Congratulations, you're divine, and your morning drink of choice is lukewarm sludge. And then there were onions. Egyptians loved onions. They thought they were magical, sacred even. To the pharaoh, though, they were just breakfast, which meant that between the onions, the beer, the gritty bread, and the figs, the royal dining room probably smelled like a high school locker room. But hey, you can't rule on an empty stomach. Once His Majesty had choked down his daily portion of onion-flavored sand bread and beer soup, it was time for work. And by work, I mean ceremonies, lots of ceremonies. Remember, pharaohs weren't just kings, they were gods on earth, which meant every morning was a marathon of rituals. Priests lined up, incense smoke filled the air, and statues of gods had to be fed, dressed, and worshipped. Yes, even statues got breakfast. Imagine spending your morning watching a group of grown men spoon-feed a golden statue. Symbolic, sure. Exciting, not even close. These rituals could last hours. Chanting, singing, offerings, more chanting. To the priests it was holy. To the pharaoh it was like sitting through an unskippable YouTube ad on repeat. And he couldn't exactly leave early. He was the star of the show. He had to look engaged, divine and radiant, even as his mind drifted to literally anything else. So picture it, the most powerful man alive, trapped in a haze of incense smoke, pretending to enjoy a ceremony he's seen 1,000 times before, sweating through his itchy linen and trying not to yawn in front of the gods. And that, dear listener, was the pharaoh's morning. The walls of temples and pyramids might show him as a radiant, flawless god, but the truth was far less glamorous. By the time noon rolled around, he was already sticky with oil, choking on incense, full of gritty bread, and tired from doing absolutely nothing except existing as a divine mascot. Being pharaoh wasn't about living in comfort. It was about appearances. The gold, the perfume, the ceremonies, they were smoke and mirrors carefully constructed to hide the fact that life in ancient Egypt, even for a god-king, was still hot, smelly, and endlessly repetitive. And if you think that sounds bad, just wait until the afternoon, because once the sun hit its peak, things only got worse. By midday, the pharaoh's morning was officially over. He'd endured the fly alarms, the sandpaper bread, the incense marathons, and the awkward reality of being a god who still had to poop like everyone else. You'd think, maybe, now comes the fun part, lounging on golden thrones, tossing pearls into fountains or whatever else Instagram would have shown if it had existed in 1400 BCE. But no, the afternoon was not relaxation. It was administration, or in pharaoh speak, pretend to enjoy endless meetings while sweating profusely. Let's start with the royal audience chamber. This was the ancient Egyptian version of a government office crossed with a theater stage. The pharaoh would sit on a throne, carved from stone, gilded in gold, cushioned with, well, almost nothing. It looked impressive, but imagine sitting on a marble bench for hours while people read grain reports at you. That was his luxury. The room itself was designed to scream authority, Giant pillars painted like papyrus reeds, walls covered in hieroglyphs declaring Pharaoh's greatness, and enough incense burning to asphyxiate a camel. Officials, scribes, priests, and petitioners lined up, each ready to bore His Majesty half to death with their problems. First on the docket, grain tallies. Ancient Egypt was obsessed with grain. Why? Because bread and beer ran the country. Grain was currency, food and tax all rolled into one, so the Pharaoh's afternoons were filled with scribes droning on about harvest numbers, storage jars and river levels. Exciting stuff, if your idea of fun is reading the back of a cereal box for 3 hours. But Pharaoh couldn't just zone out. Every number carried political weight. Too much grain, great. Too little, cue famine, riots, and possibly an assassination attempt. The God King still had to play accountant. Imagine being worshipped as divine while simultaneously arguing about warehouse inventory. That was the contradiction of Pharaoh life. Statues showed him smiting enemies, but his real battles were against supply chain shortages. Next came the petitions. Commoners, nobles, and foreign ambassadors all begging for something. A new well here, a temple repair there, or maybe just someone whining that their neighbor stole a goat. Pharaoh's job was to look wise, nod majestically, and occasionally say, "It shall be done." In reality, decisions were usually handled by advisors, while Pharaoh perfected the art of pretending to listen. And then there were the priests. Oh, the priests. They didn't just run temples, they ran propaganda. Their job was to remind Pharaoh that he was divine, indispensable and chosen by the gods. They also reminded him constantly that the temples could use more funding. New statues, new shrines, new golden trinkets. It was like dealing with a religious Kickstarter campaign that never ended. Pharaoh couldn't just say no either. Upset the priests, and suddenly the gods withheld the Nile flood. Coincidence? Maybe. Political theater? Definitely. By this point, the Pharaoh was tired, sweaty, and probably wondering why he didn't just become a goat herder instead. But the afternoon wasn't done. There was still the matter of diplomacy. Foreign envoys would arrive, each bringing tribute, which was a polite way of saying bribes to not invade us. Gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, maybe even some exotic animals. On paper, this was thrilling. In reality, it meant another round of ceremonies. Officials reading flowery speeches, gifts being presented, Pharaoh nodding while thinking about dinner. The envoys bowed, the priests blessed, and the whole thing took hours. It was like a school assembly, but with more leopard skins. Of course, not all envoys were friendly. Some came with demands, threats, or subtle insults hidden behind polite words. Pharaoh had to keep a straight face while diplomats basically called his sandals unfashionable in hieroglyphic code. The stakes were high, one bad response and you could end up with a war. Imagine doing international relations with no email, no translators you fully trusted, and a room full of guys sweating in wool kilts. Not exactly glamorous. By the time all the audiences, petitions, and envoys were done, it was late afternoon. Most people would be ready for a nap. Pharaoh. He didn't get naps. He got inspections. The ruler of Egypt had to be seen. A god king wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was a walking symbol of order. That meant touring construction sites, visiting temples, or inspecting military drills. Sounds noble, but picture this: trudging through the desert sun in heavy linen, with a crown digging into your scalp, while officials drone on about stone block placement. Every pyramid, every obelisk, every temple wall you've ever admired. Behind it was a pharaoh pretending to care deeply about limestone quality while secretly praying for shade. Military inspections weren't much better. Sure, it looked badass. Pharaoh standing tall, watching rows of soldiers march. But again, reality. A lot of dust, a lot of noise, and a lot of standing around. Soldiers paraded, archers demonstrated, chariots rolled by, all while Pharaoh tried not to faint from heat stroke. And let us be honest, no one actually thought the Pharaoh was going to grab a spear and join in. His role was symbolic: smile, nod, and wave like the ancient Egyptian Queen of England. Finally, evening approached. You might think, now he can relax. Well, sort of. Dinner was the big meal of the day, And unlike breakfast, it could actually be impressive. Meat, vegetables, fruits, honey, wine, the works. But let's not exaggerate. Pharaoh wasn't feasting on roasted unicorns. His food still came with the same issues as everyone else's. Bread, still sandy. Meat, tough and chewy. Wine, often sour and mixed with herbs to cover the taste. The royal feast looked lavish on the table, but once you bit in, it was a different story. And, of course, Pharaoh had to share the meal with courtiers, nobles and foreign guests, which meant endless small talk. Imagine hosting a dinner party every single night for people you didn't like. That was Pharaoh's relaxation. After dinner came entertainment. Musicians, dancers, storytellers, maybe even a trained monkey or two. This was the closest thing Pharaoh got to Netflix, but even that wasn't purely for fun. The performances were political, designed to show Egypt's wealth and culture. Pharaoh couldn't just sit there in sweatpants and laugh. He had to look regal, divine, and deeply appreciative of yet another flute solo. And then came the worst part of the night, rituals. Yes, more rituals. Just as the morning began with incense and chanting, the evening ended with it too. Priests recited prayers, statues were tucked in for the night, and Pharaoh had to stand there pretending this was the 1,000th time he'd heard the same hymn. If you've ever been trapped in a church service that went on way too long, congratulations. You've just experienced the Pharaoh's nightly routine. Finally, after all the ceremonies, feasts, and endless talking, the god-king could retreat to his chamber. You'd think maybe he gets peace at last, but no. His chamber was still buzzing with flies, the bed was still a hay-stuffed reed mat, and the temperature still swung between oven and freezer. Royal or not, comfort was not included. So he lay there, sticky with oils, stomach full of gritty bread and questionable wine, ears ringing with chants and probably wondering, was this really divine destiny, or just the world's most exhausting desk job in a fancy hat? Because here's the truth, the life of a pharaoh wasn't glamorous, it wasn't luxurious, it was hot, repetitive, and suffocatingly ceremonial. His face was carved in stone as immortal, godlike, perfect. But the reality was simple. He was just another human, stuck in an endless cycle of rituals, paperwork, and sand-filled sandwiches. And with that, the pharaoh closed his weary eyes, ready to wake up tomorrow and do it all over again. God on earth? Maybe. But definitely not a morning person, or an afternoon person, or an evening person.